The views and content expressed on the Pop Culture Courtroom are provided solely for educational and entertainment purposes and do not constitute legal advice. For any legal matters, please consult with a licensed attorney.
Welcome back to the Pop Culture Courtroom. I'm Matt Hardin.
And I'm William Mayfield, and today we're going to be talking about Hoosiers.
Hoosiers is considered one of the greatest sports movies to ever come out. The movie came out in 1986, directed by David Anspaugh and written by Angelo Pizzo. This is David Anspaugh's first movie he ever did, and he hit a half-court three-pointer on this one. I mean, it's a phenomenal movie.
Yeah, it's really good. One thing that's interesting about it, it's made in 1986, but it actually portrays basketball that was played in 1951, and they did a really good job of capturing that visually. I think the players' shorts had a belt as part of it, which you wouldn't see these days, and the gyms were really small. There was no three-point line, and the three-point line actually had made it to college basketball by 1986. So they were portraying the past, and they did a really good job of setting the time period.
The movie basically tracks the true story of the Milan Indians, which is a Indiana state basketball team who won the state title in 1954. Indiana famously had a one-class basketball tournament system, and what that meant was no matter what the size of your school, every team in the entire state would be in one tournament. So like in Tennessee, there's, I believe, for basketball, 6 divisions. There's 2 different ones for private schools and 4 for the public schools now. And that way you are competing against similar competition with similar resources.
Yeah, there's definitely some pros and cons to that. I actually coached at a smaller school that was in one of those smaller divisions in Tennessee, and we had a chance to win some games and to have some success that we certainly wouldn't have had against some of the bigger schools in this area. But the pro to it that's really fun is that it really makes the high school state championship a huge event that a lot of people go to. You get to see some of the best players in the state, and when you win a state championship, not that ever winning a state championship wouldn't give you a really big sense of fulfillment, but when you win the Indiana state championship, you're the only one that did that.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that basketball in Indiana is similar to what high school football is to Texas. People care a great deal. This is certainly a fictionalized version of what happened. Norman Dales, who carries this movie as the coach, who's played by Gene Hackman, is played as a man in his 50s who's come back from being suspended for life by the NCAA as the coach of Ithaca for punching one of his players, and getting this second chance after serving in the military for about 10 years because his old friend Cletus is the principal of this school.
So it's a different time back then. Right now, we could get on the internet and figure out lots of things about people's history and their past, but that wasn't the case back then. They mostly relied on articles and things of that nature, and if you're relying on a newspaper, well, that newspaper's long gone from 12 years ago. So there weren't many people who knew about this past. As the movie continues, we figure out a few people learn about the past, and it plays a role later on. But for the most part, Norm Dale's history was a mystery to the folks that were supporting the high school basketball team.
He rolls into town. The beginning of this movie is him driving to this small town in Indiana. The school's got an enrollment of 161 students. It starts with him at a crossroads, similar to what we talked about in Castaway, where he actually gets out of his car and looks around and then keeps going forward into this small town where immediately nearly everyone he comes in contact to is remarkably rude to him.
It's referenced that the old coach had passed away. Jimmy Chitwood was the best player on the team the year before that, and he had some difficulties with his family life. His father had passed away, and the coach was like a father figure to him. And so he was not wanting to play basketball, understandably. He was grieving, and just as the person who was watching over him, Myra Fleener, wanted him to focus on his studies. But I think the community probably felt a very similar way to this about this coach that had passed away too. So it was always going to be a tall task for whoever came in. Following a legend is really tough.
Well, I think also, being from a smaller town myself, growing up, they sometimes don't let in outsiders quickly. You've got to earn their trust, and the coach does some things, maybe not with the softest touch, because he does have somewhat of a prickly personality that may have made things a little bit easier if he had shown some kindness back the other way. And so Myra Fleener may be the least warm major character in a sports movie that I can remember.
Yeah, Myra Fleener stays out of any sort of criminal trouble here, but Normandale throughout the movie keeps having to earn her respect. She doesn't make it easy, and he eventually does that.
Well, and she's kept Jimmy from playing. I mean, she comes in and straight tells the coach she doesn't want him playing. She thinks she can get an academic scholarship, and he suggests, well, maybe a basketball scholarship if he's just really good. And she's like, well, nobody's going to ever see him play here. Her warming up to coach is directly in line when the coach starts winning tons of games. I don't know if that's connected or not, but it sure seems to be.
That happens quite a bit. You know, the coach's first practice, there's only 7 players to start. 2 of them immediately get frustrated and leave, so he's down to 5 players.
I'm not frustrated. I think they're more just disrespectful to the coach. You know, the coach is trying to tell him what he wants to do, how he sets up practices with him, and Buddy immediately talks back to him and he kicks him out of practice.
All of a sudden, you know, they want to talk to us about how the depth on this team is an issue, and then the depth becomes even more of an issue when that happens. I do think, as a quick aside, that the depth issue in Hoosiers is a little bit overblown because in reality, a lot of really successful basketball teams have only had a 7 or 8 man rotation. The Kentucky Wildcats in 2012 won a basketball national championship with only playing 7 guys pretty much the whole season. 7th player, Kyle Wilger, didn't play a whole lot. So
Well, and all 7 of those guys played in the NBA.
that's true. But if you have the right 7 or 8, 7 or 8's enough. Now 5, pretty tough.
I think only 5 of them play in that championship game, and we get to that later in the movie. I don't. There's no one shown other than the 5 starters playing at that final game.
Well, high school basketball games are even shorter than college games. They're 32 minutes most places, 40 minutes in college and 48 in NBA. So certainly not unfathomable to think that a player could play all 32 minutes.
So this movie starts with the coach trying to get to know his team, trying to teach fundamentals. We get to find out what kind of coach that he's going to be throughout this movie. And you and I've talked about this before. There's 3 or 4 things that make up a great coach, you know, with recruiting, getting the right players on your team. So step 1 with the recruiting, he basically tells the best player in the school he doesn't care whether he plays or not.
Well, I'd argue that ended up being really good recruiting.
I think it was too. I think he's a master psychologist, which, you know, I think is another factor, the motivation psychology of your players, and he's great at it.
Him not chasing down Jimmy Chitwood and saying you have to play or anything like that, I think it allowed Jimmy to develop some trust in the coach that he isn't selfish. You know, there's some coaches in college basketball that have sometimes been criticized for only caring about getting players that they're going to put in the NBA. And sometimes that's not super conducive to winning, but at the same time, I admire when coaches care more about the players themselves than the results.
Well, and I think I'd say the other 2 factors would include the great coach would be fundamentals and then your bench coaching ability. And how many of those do you think Coach Dale's got out of the 4?
I think he's really solid on the fundamentals. He almost focuses on the fundamentals to a fault, at least in terms of the community and the guy who was acting as coach prior to him getting there, because all of his practices, you know, a lot of his practices don't even involve a ball because they're working on fundamentals. There's a nice balance. I mean, you have to get them ready to play with a ball. And I thought that making them pass 4 times before they shot is good and bad. I like the idea of being unselfish, but if you've got a shot after 2 passes, I think you should take it. But he was really good at teaching fundamentals. His bench coaching was toned down for the movie, but it wasn't overly complex. Most of the stuff that he said was more inspirational than strategic.
I would say in looking at this that he is a master of 3 of the 4 categories. The bench coaching is certainly somewhat suspect, which I think we can talk some more about later on in the podcast. When Shooter gets involved, you know, Shooter seems to know more about the X's and O's of in-game basketball than Coach Dale does. But if you're good at 3 of the 4 and you have an assistant coach that's good at the 4, that's as most you can hope for, frankly.
Absolutely. And one thing that stood out to me was that a lot of times guys who take kind of a militaristic approach, who are like, this is my team, we do what I say. They sometimes lack the humility to know what they don't know. And in this case, that wasn't true. I think Norm Dale knew he needed help with the X's and O's, and he went out and got it, and he wasn't afraid to get it from a source that was a little bit unconventional, as long as it made his team better.
Right, and Shooter had grown up in that community. His son plays on the team. His son is Everett, who's a starter on the team, and, some of the dynamics between Shooter and his son play a big role in this. The son has the dad has an alcohol problem, and it causes a lot of problems with his family, including his relationship with his son. Once he gets involved, I mean, he gets involved because he goes and scouts the next team they're playing, and then next couple of games, he's telling the coach what to expect. I think the first one he comes in and tells them they're a bunch of mites, meaning they're small guys, and the problems with the gym is, and they're able to go forward and get it done. So what's interesting is we were talking earlier about who knows about Coach Dale's past with punching his own player in a basketball game. Shooter's one of those guys. And so, it's Cletus, Shooter, and Myra Fleener who goes to the library and does some research on it, but they all keep that secret. They decide to move past what the flaw the coach had and believe in him and move forward.
Well, and it goes towards the theme, a little bit of a theme in the movie, which is second chances, right? So Norm Dale is getting a second chance in coaching. Well, he gives Shooter a second chance in life. And ultimately, even though that had its ups and downs, at the end of the movie, Shooter is dealing with his alcoholism head on. And ultimately, it seems like it's helped the relationship with the father and the son. It helped the team overall, and it made the world a better place. And so that is an underlying theme of the movie, is second chances. Even the kids who walked out of the first basketball practice, he gave them a chance to redeem themselves as well.
Let's talk about the hitting stuff a bit. So, one of the first things we learn about in this movie is that the coach has punched one of his own players, been suspended, lifetime ban from the NCAA and high school basketball in New York. He comes to this town. Game one, there's one of these shoved by one of the other players, and starting player Raid punches the guy in the face. This is not something that's shied away from as being not an issue in these games that are taking place in the early 1950s.
It becomes clear throughout the season, for various reasons, that it shouldn't come as a huge shock when Hickory plays that there's going to be some physicality. So throughout the movie, there's a series of incidents is that involve physicality. In multiple cases, there's punching, and as is often the case with physicality, there's possibly a legal claim.
So we talked a minute ago about the punch with Raid. Does he get suspended for the rest of the year?
No, he doesn't. He gets suspended for the rest of the game, but his his coach doesn't seem particularly upset with him.
And I think it's a product of what the times were. If this happened in modern times and somebody punches a player, they're going to be suspended at least one game, probably, or more, depending on what went down.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would remember the situation with the Detroit Pistons and the Indiana Pacers, where a big fight broke out, and most of those players were suspended for the rest of the year, which was over half the year. So, other than hockey, which is still kind of organized, you pretty much can't punch people anymore.
I would say that had more to do with Ron Artest going in and hitting a fan than it did being a fight on the court, which is, I think, what we're talking about here. We have to look under the lens of the 1950s. We get to the sectional finals in Deer Lake, I believe is who they're playing, or they're in Deer Lake, they're playing Terhune. And in that game, it's very physical. Do the refs seem to have control of that game?
No, they don't. It seems a bit one-sided. They're letting tempers flare. It's just they don't have control of the game at all.
Well, and this is the game you were talking about with Shooter coming in when he's drunk on the floor. One of the Terhune players shoves a Hickory Husker player down on the ground, and the foul's called on the Husker player. So to me, that's showing that maybe the refs don't have control of what's going on in this game. Did intentional fouls, did flagrant fouls exist at that time period?
No, there's a lot of technical fouls called during this movie, but there's different variations of that now. There's flagrant 1, there's flagrant 2, there's intentional fouls. Just like in any sport, as you go along, you learn better ways to control the games. You learn better ways to properly penalize certain actions that allow for fairness and control. And we just hadn't gotten to that point in 1951.
Well, what happens when he goes out there after the shove is they call the common foul, but then shooter gets called. They get the technical foul because the drunk coach wandered out on the floor. Technical foul means 2 shots in the ball. Usually a technical foul is related to something so egregious that, like the punch, where you're going to actually get 2 shots and the ball.
Well, what struck me is that Normdale earns a lot of his technical fouls in this movie, but on that one, he was really just trying to calm down a difficult situation, and he explained to the ref, "Oh, that's just an assistant coach, don't worry about it." And the ref went and goes, "Oh, well, if he's essentially said, 'Oh, if he's assistant coach, that's a technical foul.'" There was just no need for that. All that was gonna do is instigate things even more.
Well, and so Everett is starting in this, and the only way that Coach Dale addresses that is to tell him to keep his head in the game twice. When his dad didn't show up on time as assistant coach, then he shows up drunk. Well, right after that happens, we see Everett shove one of their players down and gets a foul called. Ultimately, it's a really tight game. We get late in this basketball game with Terhune in the movie. It continues to be physical throughout the game with players shoving, pushing each other, that type of thing. With just a few minutes left, Jimmy gets an outlet pass from Everett where he's clearly going to score a easy layup to put them up by a couple of points. The Terhune player comes and shoves him very hard to the ground. Everett, who's trailing the play, immediately punches the player in the head. They grapple around, continue fighting into the hallway. The player that Everett had shoved before, is number 2 in the movie, then gets involved and pushes Everett very hard into a glass trophy case, gashing his shoulder open.
So, there's a lot going on here. The start of this action, at least, is when the player going up for the shot gets pushed in the back very hard, and then Everett comes up and punches that player.
So Tennessee, for a very long time, has had something called the stand your ground doctrine, or the castle doctrine, which allows you to reasonably defend or not have to retreat if you believe you or someone else is in danger of serious bodily harm or death, including up to and allowing use of deadly force where necessary. Now, our legislature a couple of years ago codified the law a little differently. What does that say?
Well, I think the key is there, you said you or someone else. And so the legislator has made it to where you can essentially defend a third party in the same way that you could defend yourself. So the question would be at this point, after his teammate is shoved, is Everett justified in throwing the punch that he threw?
There's a foul called here. There's nothing that indicates that it's a technical foul. At this point, do I believe that Everett is trying to protect his teammate? I do.
So it's where we differ just a little bit. I think he is doing it for his teammate. I think he is doing it to show support for his teammate. I think he's doing it in a retaliatory nature for his teammate. But do I think that he believes his teammate is in fear of some sort of imminent, serious bodily harm? I think his teammate got fouled pretty hard, and that he's mad that his teammate got fouled really hard, and so he hit the guy. Now, there's a case that you know very well that I probably wouldn't have thought was self-defense either, in the John Morant case.
So John Morant, a few years back, was involved at a pickup basketball game in Memphis. John Morant being the very famous guard that plays for the Memphis Grizzlies, great player, has had some personal demons over the years. And this particular incident, this pickup game, the high school kid, the phenom that was playing with him, took offense to something on the basketball court, threw a basketball at John Morant, which hit him in the face. And then John Morant has indicated in court that the guy stepped to him, causing him to believe that there was potential harm coming his way. Ja punches the guy in the face. Someone else that's at the game that's a cohort of Ja punches the guy in the face. And there's been a civil lawsuit, which is ongoing in Memphis now. So the statute that you cite, which is TCA 3911-612, which justifies a person in threatening or using force to protect another third person, and then the 111 version of it's the protecting yourself, is being used in that particular case as the defense to it. So there ended up being, criminal charges against his friend that were ultimately dropped for the assault on the player. And in the civil case itself, when they were doing some pretrial motion hearings, the judge made a decision that this particular statute applied in that situation, which I think is similar to what we have going on here. And that shifts the burden.
Given the ruling that you just discussed in the John Morant case, instead of John Morant having to show that this was self-defense, the person bringing the claim, the person who threw the ball at him and potentially stepped to him, is now going to have to prove that it was not self-defense, which is going to be much, much harder to do.
That's exactly right. And so I think that this particular case, would this doctrine, if we have this case in Tennessee or another case, there's many states in this country that do the stand your ground doctrine in one way or another, would Everett shoving the guy and then it leading to his injury, would he be able to bring a civil case based on his shoulder getting gashed open? You know, he later ends up having to be taken out of the next game, which is the game to decide whether they're going to the state title, because one of the players in that game punches him in his stitches, which makes him release.
And I hate to go against Hickory here because we all love Hickory. The Hickory player who initially punched the guy who fouled the shooter, I don't think that's self-defense. I think that's different than John Morant's situation, because in John Morant's situation, play had stopped, a ball was thrown to him, which was not in any way a basketball play at all. And then he, quote unquote, steps to him. Well, there's John Morant's potential belief that he's in fear of imminent bodily harm. We can debate whether or not that's true, but that at least gives him some ground to stand on, that maybe he's in fear. In this situation, the Hickory player, Everett, punches a guy who had just fouled a player. There wasn't time for that player to step to him or make any more moves. And I think it was just reactional frustration. Yeah, he was backing his player, but I don't think he had any fear that that player was in fear of imminent bodily harm. When we go a little bit further, when we talk about Everett being shoved into the glass with his shoulder, at that point, tempers have flared, punches are being thrown, there's a scrum. At that point, I think they have the other team has a better argument that Everett, who's just punched a guy, is potentially putting them in fear of imminent bodily harm, and that in order to stop that, they've got to do whatever they can. They got to use force to stop that. So I actually think in this case, the other team has a better claim than the Hickory players do.
Well, Jimmy Chipwood does stay on the ground during this entire melee that happens afterwards. He's just shown getting up after Everett is hurt. You know, Everett throws that punch, and Everett's the one that gets hurt too. The player that gets involved after the punch is a guy that was nowhere near the play. So, you know, at that point, he's essentially shoving Everett. Is there a potential claim here? Not a good one.
No. And the thing is, I guess all of these people have some sort of a claim. I mean, we've talked about assault before, and you could certainly claim that many of these contacts were assaults, but from a civil perspective, the only person that really probably has any significant damages is Everett, because he has his shoulder cut open, he's bleeding, he has potential significant injury. Well, in my opinion, once Everett threw that punch, he's going to have a hard time.
Punch from behind where the guy can't even see it. I think a jury's gonna have a hard time getting over that. And I think once you get into discovery and find out what his mental state is, a modern jury's gonna question why he's playing at all with, you know, his alcoholic father, you know, rolling in there, coach playing him anyways and telling him to just keep his head in the game. And then we have referees who I believe in this case are trying to do their best, but they don't exactly have a lot of arrows in their quiver. The rule book of the early 1950s is what they can do. There are no flagrant one, flagrant twos, you know, where they can kick players out of the game. Now but they did kick Raid out of the game, you know, earlier in that season. So they have some ability to control a game in that way. So, you know, should they have gotten a little better control of this game? Definitely. What we've not talked about is if there are particular claim against the referees in this for not controlling the game, which led to this injury. What do you think?
If the question is there a claim? Sure, maybe there's a claim. They contributed to this in some way. They let the game get out of control. They didn't do their job exactly as prescribed. But are they the main cause? Are they the main reason that this happened? Are they more than 50% of the reason that this happened? No, it's the action of the players. So certainly not a claim that I would want to pursue against these officials. I think for the most part, they got kind of caught up in this. Could they have done a better job? Sure. Is it create a solid actionable claim against them? As much as I often don't like referees sometimes, sometimes they do a great job, but I get frustrated with them just like anybody else. In this case, I don't think there's a real good claim.
I think basketball's a physical game is 1950s, and is there going to be an off call here and there? Of course, they're humans. I think, frankly, these refs are a lot better than the refs we see earlier in the season, and I think there's no claim here. If these folks called us, if we got a call from Shooter and he brought Everett in and asked us whether there's a case or not, I'd go through what we just talked about. I mean, we have comparative fault in our state, which we've talked about before, meaning that multiple persons can be held at fault, including the person who brought the lawsuit. If Everett brings a lawsuit in this case against Cherhoon, the players, the state of Indiana, whoever's running this tournament, the refs, I just don't see it. I think Everett is going to end up being held more than 50% at fault for starting that melee. And to their credit, the refs get this game under control very quickly after this massive, violent fight, and we finish out, and it works out okay.
So fortunately, our friends at Hickory are able to survive this game, win, and move on to the next stage. And now they find themselves one game away from the state championship. And the game's going along, and they run into some problems.
They're playing the regional finals against a team called Linton. There ends up being a lot of foul trouble. Buddy fouls out on a charge. Raid fouls out on a somewhat questionable call. And then the big thing that happens is Everett gets forearm shivered into his shoulder and his stitches pop. So we end up having some players come in the game that normally just sit on the bench and watch the game.
I'll tell you, I knew at the beginning of the movie when Ollie told Coach he wasn't much of a player, and that the players were talking about, well, we really only have this many players, and they didn't really include Ollie in that we had not seen the last of Ollie. And that was the case. So and with these players not being able to play, Ollie has to go in the game. Even though Coach has proven he'll play with 4 players in the past, which he did at the beginning of the movie, he goes with 5 players and he brings Ollie in. And the first few possessions don't go very well for Ollie. Hickory's lead evaporates.
So what I would question the coaching a little bit on this, knowing he's seen Ollie practice before. He knows that he's the low man on the totem pole, so to speak, and they keep throwing the ball to him. Every one of these possessions, the first one, he dribbles off his leg when he's going toward the basket for reasons only he understands, because it's under a minute left in the game and there's no shot clock.
Yeah, and this is why we go back to the 4 passes, right? 4 passes isn't always the answer. It can be.
Now, to be fair, you and I have coached my son's basketball team for many years, and if we have games where our team is considerably better than them, we force our players to make 4 passes before they do it, just to practice that.
Well, I can tell you what, if we were in the state championship, we'd do whatever, in the state semifinals, we'd do whatever was necessary to get the kids over the line.
I will say this particular game, we get this great quote from the coach. It's something that they show at basketball games, NCAA games all the time, and it's, if you put your effort and concentration into playing to your potential to be the best you can be, I don't care if the scoreboard says the end of the game. In my book, we're going to be winners. And what's the team do?
They go win.
They go win. They start clapping. Everybody's excited. It's great.
And Ollie ends up being the hero. After he makes a couple mistakes, they foul him, looks like intentionally, and he misses his first free throw, which appears to be the front end of a 1-and-1 because they don't show another
air balls.
Air balls. Well, he gets the ball towards the end with kind of in a last chance scenario where they're down 1. Why he's getting that shot, I don't know, but I do know. It's the movie.
No, it was in Jimmy Chitwood's hand, and the ball gets knocked away and goes into his hands.
So he takes a shot, decent looking shot, which made it pretty clear that this guy's probably a decent basketball player in real life and is having to tone it down. Misses the shot, and Coach has all the confidence in the world, and he goes to the line, and he shoots the free throws granny style.
So granny style meaning underhand. I was doing some research for this podcast today. I did learn something about the Hickory players. Every one of them on the team played high school level basketball except for one. Do you know who that one is?
That is the star, Jimmy Chitwood.
Who's got one of the most beautiful jump shots you'll ever see.
I did notice that these guys were good basketball players. You see sometimes in movies like Matt Saracen that guys, they're playing roles that they wouldn't be able to play in real life, and it's not particularly believable.
I think who you're referencing is the Friday Night Lights state champion leading QB1.
He's a perfect example because everyone that's ever seen him throw the ball know that he's an actor.
Jimmy here, although he was not a high school basketball player, was a college golfer at a Division I Big 12 school, Purdue. So, I mean, he's a stellar athlete.
As a fellow former college golfer that also has a beautiful jump shot, I know that's possible. And that also didn't play high school basketball. But
like Jimmy, he was robbed by that high school coach.
So
He is a good basketball player.
I still play. Ollie goes to the line and he shoots these free throws granny style. And it's not even talked about, which I actually kind of loved. That's just how he shoots them. And it was kind of they let the viewer see like, oh, this guy's shooting granny style. He's probably, most of the time when people shoot granny style from the line, they've tried it the other way and it hasn't gone well. So they've got to make a big change. And so he's probably gone through some mental torture to get to this point where he's shooting free throws granny style. But to his credit, the two biggest free throws in the history of this movie go in.
So about 10 years ago, Malcolm Gladwell, who's a famous author and podcaster, he wrote the book Outliers. I think it's his most popular book about the 10,000 hours you must be put in to be an expert at anything. Well, he did this podcast on granny shots that we're talking about here. So it looked at Rick Barry, who was a longtime NBA player, still among the top 5 highest percentage of free throws ever, shot around 90% for his career, used the granny shot. Was somebody who didn't particularly care what anybody thought about that. Well, there was a time that, Wilt Chamberlain, who's considered one of the greatest basketball players ever, he had one season where he was convinced to shoot granny shots. He shot 61% that year, which was by far the best percentage of his career, but immediately went back to doing it the regular way, much worse because of pride, not looking cool.
Shaquille O'Neal, one of the greatest centers of all time, 4-time NBA champion, but he always struggled with free throws. I mean,
when Shaquille experimented with this granny shot too, and just couldn't bring himself to do it either. But Wilt Chamberlain, I think, still has, is it a 100-point game he had?
He did. There's a famous sign of him holding the 100.
Well, that particular game, 28 for 32, granny shots.
I'm certainly not here advocating that everybody out there needs to start shooting their free throws granny style, but the reality is if one way is not working, there are other options, and regardless of how it looks, the object of the game is to put the ball in the basket.
Yeah, do you want to be prideful or do you want to win?
Correct.
And sometimes there's a mountain of evidence on one side, and people just won't do it for one reason or another.
So speaking of winning, Hickory does so, and they, from the small town of Hickory, small fictional town of Hickory, get to the state championship game. And so they show the players walking into Hinkle Fieldhouse, which is one of the most legendary arenas in all of college basketball. It's got a really, really unique look to it, and it's where the Butler Bulldogs play.
Well, not only that, it's where the actual 1954 Milan Indians won their state title.
That's true. Indiana high school basketball has a long history. So does college basketball in Indiana. The Indiana Hoosiers are one of the greatest programs of all time, one of, I believe, 6 schools that have won 5 national championships or more. And Butler played in national championships in back-to-back years in the late 2000s.
And barely missed winning. Gordon Hayward missed a half-court shot that rimmed out that would have won the game for him. It's amazing. So my understanding is that this particular game, the way the game actually played out is pretty similar to the way the real game is, including the final roughly 14-foot shot that was made by the real-life Bobby Plump, who Jimmy Chitwood is modeled after.
Yeah, the one thing they left out of this championship, because I think the score of this fictional championship was 42-40, and the score of the actual championship that Milan played in was 32-30. Well, one of the main reasons for that is that there was a time period where one of the teams held the ball for 4 minutes because there's not a shot clock.
It was Milan, the Hickory, it was the Jimmy Chitwood character. Bobby Plump just held the ball for 4 straight minutes. Not only was there not a few seconds that you're allowed before you can move the ball forward, but there's no shot clock at all, so just held the ball forever.
So there's a quote that comes to mind from the legendary Herm Edwards. You play to win the game. And if the game looks bad or looks unaesthetically pleasing, that's someone else's problem. The reality is there was no shot clock, and if that gave them a strategic advantage, that's what they should do.
Well, and Coach uncorks during this in one of the speeches during this game, the "I love you guys," which just looks him dead in the eye. It's gets a little misty during that part. I mean, it's probably his greatest speech of the year.
Well, Normandale is one of those guys where he doesn't just give out respect. He doesn't just he doesn't you have to earn it from him, and I think he realized that at that time that showing them that they had earned the love and respect from him would give them the confidence to face their opponent, because if they had earned that from him, then they could certainly win this game.
Yeah. Well, and you end up the movie with this young boy sitting in the Hickory Gym shooting foul shots and the repeat of "I love you guys." Definitely one of my top 5 sports movies ever.
Yeah, it was really, really good, and it fell into the typical kind of underdog story that you see, but they found a way to put kind of a unique twist on that, and the fact that it was inspired by it closely resembled Milam's Run is really cool as well.
So I'll say one more thing about the championship that we missed talking about, which is Coach coming in at the end, calls the picket fence on the last play, and does he want Jimmy to shoot that shot?
Now, he actually, I assume, is using Jimmy as a decoy there and wants another player to shoot the shot, and all the players are looking at him funny, and he's like, "What's wrong, guys?" And Jimmy goes, "I'll make it, coach."
Yeah, Jimmy has like 4 lines in the movie, and this one being the best of them all, and he drills the shot, and they win the title. So we're gonna move on to our irrelevant evidence. So we talked briefly in the beginning about Norman Dale receiving a lifetime ban from the NCAA and not being able to coach high school basketball in New York as well. And so for our relevant evidence here today, we're going to talk about would that actually have happened during the time period that we're talking about?
It's interesting how things kind of come full circle, because there was at the time period that happened, which is actually 10, 12 years prior to the movie.
Roughly 1939,
Right.
1940.
The NCAA, that wasn't really its purpose. They weren't trying to like regulate who could and couldn't coach. Why did the NCAA even come about?
Well, in the early 1900s, there was no NCAA. You know, football had dated back even farther than that. There was very, very serious injuries. There was, in 1904 in particular, there was 18 deaths in college football from players, and a lot of it had to do with wanting to not have professional, full-size grown adults playing in college football games where there's not any rules or parameter for it. But the NCAA didn't even have a full-time director as a part-time staff until the 1951-ish era. You know, the guy that was named the director ended up was the director of the NCAA still in the 80s when this movie came out. It wasn't until after World War II where they came up with something called the Sanity Code, which looked at significant additional rules that covered financial aid, recruitment, academic standards. And that's the beginning of the NCAA as we actually know it. This movie was written in 1985. That was within just a few years of an incident that happened with Woody Hayes and Ohio State.
Woody Hayes is coaching with Ohio State against Clemson Tigers. Woody Hayes had a series of incidents in his past that were already causing him some issues, but what Ohio State really liked about him was all those championships that he was winning. So
He won 5.
his team turns the ball over to Clemson. This defensive lineman kind of comes to the sidelines, and he's like mildly celebrating, if that. And Woody Hayes just knocks him out. I mean, it's just takes a full on punch, and that obviously causes tempers to flare. What amazed me in reviewing that is how little the Clemson guy did to instigate Woody Hayes. Looked like to me he was just mad that his team turned the ball over and wasn't going to win.
Well, he punched him in the throat, and the athletic director fires him the next day. He had incidents for years and years. I mean, there's a story told about Woody Hayes was a lefty, and the players at practices that would make him mad would go on his left side because they knew he'd have to rear up to be able to punch him. He's punching his own players during games. This is the time period where the 70s, which is a much more in touch with your feelings era than the early 1950s would have been, with a coach that has repeatedly done things like this. And so it's not particularly a surprise that he got fired during that era.
Someone who I think Normdale is probably I don't know if loosely based off is the correct term, but they at least took features from, is the famous Bobby Knight. So Bobby Knight was probably the most well-known college basketball coach in the country, not just in Indiana at the time. Indiana had won a national championship in 1976 and 1981. They would actually go on to win one after this movie as well in 1987. But Bobby Knight, as good a basketball coach as he was, and as famous as he made the Indiana program, was also a famous hothead. And by the time that this movie had happened, he had famously thrown a chair across the floor against Purdue and gotten suspended for 1 or 2 games, something like that. There are shreds of Bobby Knight all over this film.
Yeah, and I think Bobby Knight cared about his players deeply as well. I mean, Norman Dale shows that when that last game before the state finals, whenever it gets his stitches popped out and he thinks about putting it back in, tells him to patch him up and thinks better about it and then chooses his player, which, shows the growth of that character from what he had been before. But this coach has learned something from his mistakes. Bobby Knight ended up having a series of incidents and got fired for Indiana for a relatively minor problem with one of the later players, but it was a culmination of the problems. And I think a lot of that is similar to what happened to what you talked about with Woody Hayes.
Yeah, Bobby Knight's situation was certainly a straw that broke the camel's back situation. Never mind the fact they weren't winning as much as they used to, but um, you know, I read an article by Jay Billis upon Bobby Knight's passing that was essentially like, I'm not gonna try to mold your opinion of Bobby Knight, but the Bobby Knight I know loved me and cared about me, and there were lots of good features, and ultimately that's what we end up seeing in Norman Dale, is that even though he took this really tough hardline approach at the beginning of the movie, it led to a positive place. Going back to the NCAA situation, the 1940s, the NCAA was very new. Um, the National Invitation Tournament and the NCAA tournament there was debate over which one was more important at the time. Obviously, that has become the NCAA tournament these days, as the NCAA tournament is one of the most popular sporting events in the world. It isn't necessarily realistic that he would have been suspended for life by the NCAA. What is realistic is that it wouldn't be big time public knowledge.
Because of the internet and the more difficulty finding archives for papers outside large city libraries. Well, the NCAA basketball tournament did not exist until 1939. And that's approximately the time period of when this incident would have happened. There was no NCAA basketball tournament. There's all kinds of, the NCAA baseball did not have a national title when this happened. So that's just to show the infancy of this part-time NCAA and what they did. And I think modern folks are looking at what's the NCAA, how are they all in the business of all these schools now and under the lens of what it had been like in the 80s. And that gets juxtaposed on this movie a bit. And it's a plot device more than anything else. It's the fallen angel that's getting a second chance at life and making the most of it, and while still staying pretty true to his character. If you ever read the Season on the Brink, the John Feinstein book about a year with Bobby Knight, he's a deeply flawed man with a lot of greatness in other areas where his talents are so good that for the most part he's able to overcome kind of the problems. And I think he softens in his later years. He goes on to, was it Texas Tech?
I went to Texas Tech in the mid 2000s. Had a good run there for a team that at the time had not historically had any basketball success. They've had some recently, but they hadn't at that time.
Well, the more recent incident we can think of is when the Juwan Howard at Michigan and got into the argument with Greg Gard after Wisconsin had pummeled Michigan, ends up slugging one of the assistant coaches, Joe Krabenhoft, in the face. And does he get suspended for life for that?
No, he didn't get suspended for life. He got a suspension, but I'll go back to what I've said a few times this podcast. What got him fired? Going 8-24.
Right. That's exactly right. So I think looking at our relevant evidence, I come down on the position. I don't believe that given the time period of this happened and the NCAA in its infancy, that never would have happened. Coach Dale would not have been banned for life for that.
No, no, and one thing that struck me about Coach Dale in this, when he's explaining that, he goes, "I'm not gonna try to explain that or say that it was right." He accepts it, but we move on to this second chance portion, and I think, again, this film falls in line with a lot of underdog stories, but the second chance nature continually throughout the story was what made it a bit unique for me. And I really enjoyed my rewatch of this.
Well, I think that's one of the most American values. All of us have flaws, but getting that second chance to overcome a mistake you've made is part of what makes this a great country. Well, thank you for joining us for this edition of the Pop Culture Courtroom.
I'm William Mayfield.
And I'm Matt Hardin. We'll see you next time.
The Pop Culture Courtroom is a Matt Hardin Law production.
If you've been involved in a car wreck or any other type of personal injury or wrongful death case, check us out at matthardinlaw.com or give us a call at 615-200-1111.